I'm Rob Trzynski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the intellectual foundations of a free society. My guest today is Shay Khatiri, who is a policy associate at the Renewed Democracy Initiative, has also written for The Bulwark, and has written for Symposium. Thanks for coming on, Shay.
Thanks for having me over, Rob.
So the piece that we had late last year did a piece, published one of your pieces calling for a liberal Leviathan. And it's not what people might think. You're not talking about a domestic Leviathan. You're not talking about liberal in the sort of weird American sense of meaning, left of center, but the idea of a free society as a foreign policy Leviathan, as a strong and powerful country acting on behalf of freedom. So I wanted you to sort of describe the case for why, and it's a very unpopular thing right now. We're in a very isolationist kind of moment. So I want you to talk about the case for why we need to have America be a Leviathan in the world.
So I stole the title from John Eikenberry, Liberal Leviathan, which is the title of his book. And I really like that title because it is somewhat paradoxical. It is, you wouldn't expect a Leviathan to be liberal, but America is both. It is the only monster at the sea, and it acts quite monstrously at times when it needs to, but it is also quite liberal. And
it's similar to the phrase "an empire for liberty." I think Jefferson coined, of the idea of we're going to spread over this whole continent and be a vast empire by the scale of European politics, but it was going to be an empire for liberty.
So Madison and Jefferson, in their correspondences together, called America an empire for liberty or empire of liberty interchangeably. I prefer empire for liberty because empire of liberty constrains that liberty to within the empire, while for liberty makes it the cause of the empire. And so in either case, it's actually exactly quite similar, empire for liberty or liberal Leviathan. They're both paradoxical phrases. And the key to American foreign policy and American hegemony, global hegemony, I must say, since the end of World War II has been the fact that we have created a set of rules around the world, and everybody talks about how, and these rules are quite liberal. That is to say, members of the international order all have to abide by the same rules, and they all get to exercise certain rights. It's some people say it's rules-based, and it is rules-based, but it's more than that, rights-based, that you're entitled to self-defense, you're entitled to sovereignty, and you are stripped of that sovereignty right if you conduct genocide, for instance, as we did in the Balkans. And we have neglected that responsibility, obviously, quite a few times, but that's part of the right. That's especially when the Clinton administration codified that in the United Nations as right to protect, or R2P. And it is based on commerce, which is another very liberal idea. And also, when I say Leviathan, it's that some people criticize America at that, but you break the rules. And which brings you back to the idea of a state, of a liberal state, that there are two sets of different rules for the state and for citizens. A state gets to commit violence against criminals, but a citizen does not. So the rules that apply to others, which is to treat each other, members of the international community or international world, I guess, order, that they have to not be offensive against each other. That does not apply to the United States. So we get to be offensive to another state that is breaking international norms and international rules. For instance, we did it in the Balkans in the 1990s. We did it against Saddam Hussein twice, for once on the correct grounds that he had invaded another country, and a second time on mistaken grounds that we believed that he was developing nuclear weapons. And we did it throughout the Cold War as well. And this is what makes America both a Leviathan and liberal. In other words, the monstrosity that America commits is in defense of liberalism. And last, I like the phrasing of Leviathan also because it is the only monster at the sea. And it goes back to the theory of hegemonic order, that the most stable form of international order is when there's only one hegemon who does not allow the rise of a peer competitor. Mm-hmm. And that is true of the American order, and it is hegemonic. It's one superpower, which has preserved peace the longest time in human history.
Well, and we actually have something called the I think somebody called it the war recession, or the long peace is the other term that's used. But basically, since World War II, you see a collapse in the number or a decline in the number of global wars and the number of casualties from war. And after the end of the Cold War, when there was, we became the one superpower, that goes off a cliff, and it becomes much, even things like Syria barely register compared to, as horrible as that is, barely register compared to what was fairly normal 50, 60 years earlier. So I think people don't realize the extent to which we actually did have a long peace that was maintained by that liberal Leviathan that was very different from what was happening before.
So if you allow me, I have 3 points to build upon your very good point. One is that the decline of violence theory, which I'm blanking on his name.
Steven Pinker.
Steven Pinker, thank you. Steven Pinker proposed. It's empirically correct, but what Pinker doesn't mention in his book is that it's perhaps the greatest cause of it is the American world order that has not allowed for any other war, a great war, to erupt. And when you go into, when I say it has preserved peace the longest time, people criticize me that, have you not seen all the wars that have been happening in the world? And yes, true enough, but those wars, if you find them outrageous, it means that you have been spoiled by the American order, because in comparison to what was happening until 1945, those wars pale in comparison. In fact, what is very interesting is when you go throughout, since the completion of the Enlightenment project in 1700s, I guess, 1600s, 1700s, when Enlightenment, modern Enlightenment happened, nations became, I guess, states became richer, technology became much more advanced, including war technology, military technology. And the idea of military science became a thing. You started having military academies. And because of that, you suddenly see a massive increase in the casualties of wars. And every war is much more ruinous than the previous one, because weapons become deadlier, because states become richer, because they become better at understanding how to conduct violence. And until 1945, every single continental war, Great War, is much more ruinous, destructive. And then war stops at 1945. We have, if another war happens, God forbid, another great war, it will be the most ruinous war that has ever happened. And the Great War after that will be even more ruinous. So this long period of peace without a Great War has been a historical anomaly, and it has spoiled us. It has literally spoiled us if we think that war is too crazy right now. And the last point I want to make is, you mentioned Syria, and the two greatest catastrophes in the Middle East since 1945 have been Iran-Iraq war and the Syrian civil war. Together, they amount to somewhere maybe even 2 million dead, the two of them, millions displaced, and both are results of American inaction.
So speaking of American inaction and the problem of allowing a peer competitor, that I think brings us to, this is all, we can talk about this in an abstract and general way about the history since World War II, but it's all very relevant right now at this moment because of what's going on or possibly about to go on in Ukraine. And with this sort of Russia bringing the prospect, at least, of a continental war back to Europe.
I actually have a forthcoming piece for the Bulwark about 3 different scenarios about how this war could spill into the rest of Europe. And there are a few things we need to keep in mind. One is that Russia, since the end of the Cold War, has conducted offensive action, military action, against its neighbors 3 times. One was against Moldova, once in 2008. That Moldova was 1996 or 8, I believe. Once against Georgia in 2008, and once against Ukraine since 2014, which has been going on. And it is currently occupying 3 foreign territories. I'd like to say the Russian military is occupying 4 countries, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, and Russia. and it has been, to a great extent, a result of inaction by us the past 3 times, the first 3 times, I guess, that due to a different host of circumstances, set of circumstances, we did not react. In Moldova, it was too small, and the current US administration was quite distracted during its second term. And also, it was that we could not really offend Russia too much at the time because we're working on one, security cooperation, hoping that the new Russia, as it was called, would eventually become democratic and peaceable, which we were wrong about. But also, we were arguing with Russia, asking for their consent over NATO enlargements to former Warsaw Pact countries. And
I think we're also helping them decommission a large portion of their nuclear arsenal as well.
Their own and Ukraine's,
yeah,
and Kazakhstan's. So so there were a lot of issues that we were working with Russia in the 1990s that did not allow us, or we thought that would prevent us from reacting. In 2008, we have a very war-weary United States, and we have a Europe that is not a Western Europe, I guess, that is not in on good terms with the United States to some extent. And this is not to say of governments, but more the populace, I guess populaces of Western European countries that were upset with us. Actually, we had quite good relationships with United Kingdom, France, and Germany after Schroeder and Chirac left. But their populations were not quite supportive of us.
And I also think Georgia was a little too far out on the periphery on the other side of the Black Sea. I do remember one thing that I do remember about that is that when the Russians invaded Georgia, there was this like rotating contingent of foreign ministers from Europe who were going into the capital of Georgia and basically saying, I'm going to show up here and basically to help provide a certain degree of protection from having Russian tanks just roll into the capital.
No, absolutely. And it's completely true. And the first point is especially true that just Americans, and this we can talk about China later.
Yeah.
And Americans have a Europe bias, and I'm not even complaining about it. I'm a Europe firster. I've always been a Europe firster, and Americans have a European bias that they care about Europe more than anywhere else. And the last point of it is that the Bush administration is quite unpopular, and a month after the invasion happens, Lehman Brothers collapse, and America completely becomes distracted. Even John McCain, who said we're all Georgians now, starts talking about the economy. So that was also a problem. And then the Obama administration comes in and tries a reset of relations with Russia, quite literally tries to appease Russia by getting rid of the anti-missile program we had in Czech Republic and Poland. And Russia becomes more assertive and more aggressive because so far it has seen no pushback. And even after the invasion of Crimea, people are mistaken that Russian invasion of Crimea led to a regime of sanctions against Russia. First, the sanctions are quite soft. And second, it was not the invasion of Crimea. Europeans still were unconvinced to impose sanctions on Russia after Crimea. It was the shutting down of the Malaysian airliner on route, I believe, from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, that by Russian forces that finally convinced Europeans to impose sanctions. Short of that, sanctions would have never been imposed against Russia. And Putin has learned his lesson that aggression doesn't receive pushback. There's a saying by Lenin that lead with bayonets, and if you hit steel, withdraw. You probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you proceed. If you find steel, you withdraw. And so far, Putin has found mush all along. So he has proceeded. For the first time, he is hitting steel. For the first time, he is witnessing absolute Western resolve to push back against him.
Interesting thing. I had a conversation just yesterday, actually, with somebody I know who's in Ukraine. He's a Belarusian, but he's in Ukraine now, sort of out of the frying pan into the fire. But he was actually saying that he thinks that he was upset about the increased American talk about the possibility of war, because he saw it as an attempt by the Biden administration to sort of force Ukraine into accepting a diplomatic deal, which would sort of give the store away to Russia by saying, oh, well, there's going to be a war, so therefore you have to make a deal. But, so he seems much more complacent about the idea that, well, Russia won't invade Ukraine. They can't really do it. They don't really have enough troops to do it. And there's something to that. But, the thing that struck in my mind about Putin was there was a story a couple of months back about him and Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, doing a hockey match. Right. And they were on the ice, and each of them scores like 8 goals each. And it's one of those Idi Amin kind of moments, where Idi Amin was dictator of Uganda. He used to have these soccer matches, and he would score all the points, and he'd always win because everybody was afraid to stop him. The idea that these two like 60-year-old guys are going to get up there and score 8 goals each in a hockey game is ridiculous. Clearly it's rigged for them. And I think you could interpret that one of two ways. One is that Putin's kind of a coward, and that he only will play a game if it's already rigged, so he knows he's going to win. So that's the case for him not being willing to invade. That when if he realizes this is a gamble, it's not already rigged. This is not a tiny weak little nation where I can just go through. Then he won't do it. But the other side of it is this is a guy who spent basically the last 10, 20 years winning hockey games, automatically. And that can sort of puff up the sense of everything I do is I'm going to succeed. He's surrounded by yes men. He's surrounded by these rigged things. It can actually create the delusion in his own mind that everything I do will succeed and no one will ever resist me. And that might embolden him to take what is actually an enormous risk.
So there are two different ways to read Putin. One is that Vladimir Putin is, as you said, has surrounded himself. In fact, you kind of touched on both. One is that Vladimir Putin has surrounded himself with yes men, and all of them are telling him that he can go in and essentially giving him very bad advice. And that is a trend we have seen among tyrants, that they surround themselves with yes men, and it becomes an echo chamber, and that becomes their Achilles' heel. That's what happened to Hitler to a great, many thanks to his idiocy. We could win the World War because of that. And that's true. And based on the intelligence and the reporting that we receive, people whom Putin is increasingly surrounding himself with are, as a friend put it, he has now one of his, basically the only close advisor he has is somebody who makes John Bolton look like a dove. And on the other, people based on the personalities around Putin are saying that he's receiving the advice that he can go in and easily win, and that's what also we know from the disclosures that the Biden administration has made, that Putin believes this. The other reading of Putin that I have always been I have always believed to be more accurate, and that might have changed, by the way, is that Putin is rather conservative, that he doesn't want to pick up challenges that he cannot win, and nobody wants to pick up a challenge he cannot win, but he's quite cautious about that, and doesn't like taking big risks. And if in fact, in 2008, we remember an easy victory for the Russians, but Putin was quite disturbed by it because the Russian forces really struggled in Georgia. And I believe 8 Russian military planes were shot down. 5 of them were shot down by friendly fire. And he was very disturbed and undertook a massive military readiness and build up operation. When in 2014 he went into Ukraine, it was a completely different force. So I think that's always been true of Putin, and he's probably still cautious as a matter of his own personality. But also it's true that people he's increasingly surrounding himself with are, to borrow a phrase from a former world leader, they're not the best people. And you see that Vladislav Surkov, who was a key advisor to Putin and the father of Putinism, in fact, he has been expelled from Kremlin circles for 2 years almost now. And we do not know exactly how the new Vladimir Putin is thinking. I do think that he's realizing increasingly that he's bitten more than he can chew, but he's also cornered himself into a terrible situation that he cannot withdraw because he would look weak, and he cannot go in because he would look weak. And he's receiving also pushback from Kremlin supporters even. You saw many pro-Kremlin intellectuals and academics, and even some retired senior military officers signing letters, making statements that, no, do not go to war with Ukraine. And the biggest problem with going to war with Ukraine is that Russians do not mind killing Muslim Syrians. They do mind killing Ukrainians. The Russian people and the Russian elite are actually fond of Ukrainians, and they do not want watching their military kill what Putin calls their brethren. And even over the past 8 years of the civil war that Russia has been Russian forces has been stealthily fighting, they do not make a big hay out of the dead Russian soldiers for returning from Ukraine in Russia, presenting them as martyrs of the Russian Empire, like they did in Syria. So that is also another liability. I do think that that at this point, it's a 50-50 chance of doing it and not doing it, because he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. And to its credit, Biden administration and Secretary of State Tony Blinken has done quite a good job in putting together a diplomatic coalition against Russia. I think what's missing is the military element that for instance, the president has said there will be no American forces in Ukraine. And it's quite a mistake, because there were thousands of American forces in Ukraine for training purposes. And the president last week withdrew those forces instead of increasing. We probably cannot afford to send combat units into Ukraine, but logistical and training forces are absolutely right and proper to be in Ukraine, and they have ever since been withdrawn. Another problem is that it reminds me of the Berlin crisis, that the Kennedy administration actually showed enormous resolve to Khrushchev by massively proposing a massive military conventional military buildup, while the administration has done no such thing. In fact, we don't even know if we are going to get a budget this year, and whether we are going to fund the military or just have a continuing resolution, while the president should go forward and say, no, this is a new world. I thought I could just deal with China, which I cannot. We have two problems. I need a huge military budget, just to send a message to Putin. And he has sent troops to the Baltics, to additional troops to Baltics to show American resolve to defend the Baltics. But sending troops to Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania means that you're going to defend Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, not that you're going to defend Ukraine. So I think that's the biggest missing element.
Yeah, and the thing about the military element too is that, you know, there's been this whole talk about, oh, we're going to pivot to China, as if you get to decide where you get to pivot to. I mean, you know, the enemy was a saying that troops used to have in the Iraq War: the enemy gets a vote, right? You can decide on what your strategy is going to be, but the enemy gets a vote. And you know, if you decide you're going to pivot to China, people will say, "Great, go pivot to China. I'm going to go take Ukraine."
A Russian once said, "You might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." And it absolutely, I joke that Biden might be interested in China, but Putin is interested in Biden. And just if I may add, one thing that actually is quite disturbing to me about the U.S. foreign policy over the past few decades is that we seem not to have any other tools, non-military tools, than sanctions. And one that is eventually going to weaken the American economic power as a geopolitical tool, because we are overusing it, and at some point that's going to become a problem like our debt, but that's a different issue. But something that has completely been missing is just the power of imagination to look into other tools of competition and rivalry. And one is our enemies use disinformation against us all the time, and we seem not to have any idea how to counter that in an offensive way or defensive way. But as an offensive way, They use disinformation. We're going to use information, accurate information. Dear Russian people, Mr. Putin has this much money. You're starving. Let's let them know. And many other, what many people, and my friend Topher Harrison is very good on this. One thing that some people call political warfare, but I call informational warfare. All warfare is political at its core. Weaken the regime from within using information.
This is the Radio Free Europe strategy that we use very successfully in
very successful. In fact, something that people don't know, we were going to use it as a propaganda operation initially, and then we realized that we don't need propaganda. It's actually more effective if you just read the news. And we have been lazy. We have the internet, and instead of thinking how it can make it more effective, we have come to think that because of the new realities of internet, we can never be effective anymore with information. Instead of, we have a greater reach. So, or another one is just have covert agents in intelligence agents in the Kremlin, in Russia, I guess, which we do have, obviously, spies. Use the spies to turn Putin's own operatives against them. And, or in Iran, or in China, or against any enemy. We have completely lost sight on any non-military means other than sanctions, and that is a huge issue.
Yeah, I think there's two issues there. One is that, my sort of theory on people ask you, what are the different schools of foreign policy? Are you an internationalist, or are you a neoconservative, et cetera? And I find that schools of foreign policy...
I'm a neoconservative, by the way, but go on.
Well, I find that the way those schools tend to be, I'm like the last, I find myself weird because I don't call myself a neoconservative, but I'm like the last one of a handful of us who are left who are advocates of George W. Bush's forward strategy of freedom.
I like that phrasing, forward strategy of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, that's the forward strategy. That's what I was trying to get at in a second. But what I want to also say is I think too many of these debates on foreign policy, the different schools of foreign policy, tend to be defined not in terms of what are our goals or what are our objectives, but what tools should we use? And they tend to focus on, well, we should use this tool over here. We should use diplomacy. We should use international organizations. We should use the military, and not, my attitude is don't define yourselves in terms of which tool you should use and what tools you should not use. Use all the tools, right? Use everything we have, and you define, your policy goals in terms of what is the outcome you want to achieve. And then you use every goal you have, every tool you have to achieve that. But I think the biggest tool that we're not using, or we call it a tool maybe, but the biggest thing we're not doing is, I think the reason why I think this moment is particularly dangerous and why Putin might actually be crazy enough to start a war is he's gotten used to, and this is, I think there's a lot of similarities to Europe in the 1930s. He's gotten used to the situation where he acts and we react, where he's the one always taking the initiative and making something new happen on the ground. And then we sit around and dither for 6 months, what should we or shouldn't we, or what, and we don't have a proactive strategy. And that's, the forward strategy idea. We don't have a proactive strategy for here's what we're going to do to try to move events towards our goals.
So that's actually very interesting you bring up. I was talking to a friend last week, and we remember the Cold War. So let me begin with this. That is partially due to our being a liberal empire, that, in liberalism, you don't punish somebody preemptively. And I happen to think that sometimes you need to, but I kid when I say preemptively. No, we're not going to punish Putin preemptively. It's very reactive to his domestic conduct. Any dictatorship, we can punish them for their domestic conduct, and not through military means. I mean, through freedom agenda, something like that, a forward deployment of freedom. And it brings me to the Cold War. We remember the Cold War objective as containment, but containment died with Ronald Reagan. We were not containing the Soviet Union. We were conducting offensive campaigns in communist states by supporting resistance movements, like Solidarity is the most famous one.
Yeah, actually,
but also
you just touched on something that's sort of a pet peeve of mine, because people think, oh, the Cold War doctrine was containment. They forget that early on, under Truman and Eisenhower, there was a whole debate between containment and rollback was the goal. And I think Reagan was a return to that idea that, we're not just going to contain the Soviet Union, we're going to roll it back, which he did. And that's it's astonishing when you consider also how little we actually did in the 1980s, how little we did in terms of actual fighting or actual outwardly offensive things. We just did a lot of small things that created that pressure and produced the rollback.
So the great anti-communists of the Cold War era, one of the fathers of conservatism, John Burnham, had a book, Containment or Liberation. And it's true. I mean, we did adopt containment for most of the Cold War, and early on there was that debate, but containment won that debate again until Reagan. Reagan comes in and says, no more, we are going to take the fight to communist states. And we basically flipped communist states one by one, and what results in many factors resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union. But there is a great essay by Mark Kramer, who's a great historian of Soviet Union and Russia. And Professor Kramer lays it out very well in his 3-essay series, which he says that what brings the collapse of the Soviet Union is that protests begin to erupt, and because to a great extent due to our information campaigns in communist states, but also due to our support for resistance movements. And Soviet Union and their satellite governments do not punish the protesters. And then the Soviet subjects realize that, oh, if we start to protest, we're not going to be penalized. Learning from that experience, and the Soviet Union collapses. Of course, there are differences. I think all the totalitarians have learned that terrible lesson from the Soviet Union, that whatever you do, suppress protests. But nevertheless, there is a lot of wisdom in the idea that we should be supporting resistance movements. We should be weakening adversarial regimes, something we have completely lost touch with, how to do and what to do with it, and partially because we don't have the infrastructure. I mean, the Obama and the the Obama and the Trump administrations were criticized for not supporting protest movements around the world. One that's important to me is Iran, since I was born and raised there. But I think the greater blame doesn't go to the fact that they did not support the protesters, because we don't have actually much capacity to do it. I think the greater blame goes to the fact that they never built such an infrastructure. So when protests erupted in Iran or in Russia or wherever, we could support them.
Yeah, and that's you talk about support for solidarity. That there was this huge effort that was done. They talk about the president, the Pope, and the Prime Minister. Thatcher and Reagan and John Paul II. This huge effort that was done to figure out how do we build this infrastructure to support the solidarity movement, and doing it through the churches and that sort of thing. And yeah, I agree that there's been this. Well, this gets back to our sort of Vietnam syndrome. So I grew up in the era of the Vietnam syndrome, sort of the area from the late 70s into the early 80s, where it's like, no, we can't, we were so stung and so disillusioned with Vietnam that we're just not going to intervene and do anything anywhere. And of course, the result was 10 years in which the Soviet Union greatly expanded, and they, into Central America, into Afghanistan, et cetera. And there was just a sense that America's passive and not going to do anything, and you could expand forward. And we're back in that Vietnam syndrome now, where we're sort of paralyzed of maybe if we just, maybe if we don't do anything in the rest of the world won't bother us. It'll all go away. Why should we get involved? And that passivity that I think has seeped into both the left and the right in different ways.
So we are a democracy, and democracy works on trial and error. And because of that, we very often try very stupid ideas and they fail. And then we try the good ideas. And it was Winston Churchill who said that you can always rely on Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted every other option. And Vietnam syndrome was a result of democracy and trial and error. And let's put it this way, there was trial and there was a lot of error. But we learned from it. And there is a good case to be made that without Vietnam, there's no Carter, and without Carter, there's no Reagan. And I like to make a joke that we had a corrupt Republican jerk as president, succeeded by a good-hearted, completely incompetent Democrat, succeeded by Ronald Reagan, which reminds you of Trump, Biden, and that's why I'm putting my money on Liz Cheney for 2024. But
good luck with that. But that's the question. It's like, is there? I'm not sure there's a Reagan waiting in the wings right now.
So that's a good question. I mean, Ronald Reagan's political career was declared dead in 1976, and he makes a comeback. And as for Liz Cheney, I mean, most great statesmen and stateswomen have spent some time in the wilderness. And this is not, and yes, for every great man or great woman who's been in the wilderness and made a comeback, there are millions who have never made the comeback. And it remains to be seen what Cheney's fate is. But in a broader point, even if not Cheney, I think there is a great avenue for a creative candidate in 2024, or God forbid 2028, if it goes that long, to just come out and have a I like to say, a very American honor way of talking about foreign policy, that we need to restore national honor. We need to, what we did in Afghanistan was disgraceful. We have had over a decade of unmuscular, weak foreign policy, and it is time to restore national pride to our foreign policy and be the America we used to remember. And by the way, as for Nixon and Trump comparison, setting aside their similarities, and they had actually more differences than similarities. Nixon was a terribly intelligent man, and Donald Trump, one shall not accuse Donald Trump of intelligence, but one thing that they did have in common was that instinct of détente, that Trump tried détente with every adversary we've had. Iranians never bought into it, just rejected it. He tried with them, but tried it with Russians, tried it with the Chinese. He used to call Chairman Xi a great man, and he tried it with North Korea. So there was even that. So, and it is not to say that that it's because just an accident of history that these two men were so similar. I think they were also both quite socially conservative, culturally conservative, law and order, and I don't mean Trump personally, but his policies, economically populist. And I think it's just the periodic periods of American politics that we go through every often. And it just happens that the two times that we had Deton populists, they both happen to be corrupt, and maybe the two go hand in hand. I don't know, but we do go through these periods and we come out of them. And the question is that we come out of it inevitable? I don't know. I hope, but I sure hope that we come out of this one as soon as possible.
Yeah, I don't think it's inevitable, but I do think there is that factor of, democracies try dumb things, and when they don't work, they go casting about for somebody who has an alternative to that dumb thing, and it raises the stock politically of whoever's on the other side. But I think also you have to make the case, because I think right now there's this attitude. I mean, the default American attitude has always been, can we just ignore the rest of the world? We're a big, we span the continent. We're a big country. We're protected by oceans. Why should we, if Japan hadn't attacked us at Pearl Harbor, how long would it have taken us to get into World War II? We would have not wanted to do it. It was not a popular idea. So I think the case has to be made for, I guess, why it is we should care. Why not just let these people be dictators off there? What does it affect us? And that's one of the things that you talked about in your piece for Symposium about the Liberal Leviathan. And it's something I think is really coming up a lot with China and with Russia right now, which is that the one thing, lessons we have to learn is dictatorships are never content just to stay within their own borders and oppress their own people. They're always expanding out and trying to spread their system and spread their influence outside their borders.
That is not true of all dictators, but it is certainly true of imperialist ideological totalitarians like Russia. And there is a
well, and I think part of what's happened over the last 20 years is Russia sort of, Putin helped cobble together back a sort of ideological basis for Russian imperialism. Quasi-ideological.
Actually, it's not quasi. It's quite ideological. There's a huge element of Christian nationalism in Russian domestic and foreign policies.
The Third Rome.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of people on the American right, populist right, who are very Christian, like Putin, because and Orban, because the Christianity appeals to them. I always say that it was no coincidence that 10 days after Windsor, the United States, the Duma case was struck down. Duma passes the anti-gay bill, and Putin waits 2 months before he signs it into law until, 10 days after the case was heard at the Supreme Court, it passed the Duma. Putin waits 2 months until Supreme Court strikes it down, and days later he signs it into law. It was directed at American Christians. Franklin Graham and Pat Buchanan write columns about how America is no more a source of moral clarity. Vladimir Putin is. They both wrote those columns. Graham went to Russia to meet with Putin. So it is quite ideological. The question is whether it is totalitarian or not. And I say that it is. It is quite totalitarian. And some people disagree with me, but that's a different argument. But yes, the thing is that Russia, Iran, and China are all former empires, and they all have a very rich history of honor foreign policy, I would say, imperial foreign policy that relies on national greatness. And it's something that appeals to their peoples. A lot of my friends in Iran, whom I talk with, say, we don't like the Islamic Republic, but whatever replaces it, we don't mind it. We actually would like it to be an empire. And it's also true of the Russians and the Chinese. It has a lot of appeal to them for their governments to be imperial. And we need to come to grip with it that these are regimes that have some domestic incentive to be imperial, but also they have ideological incentives to be imperial. And they're not going to, Putin's appetite for imperialism is not going to be satiated with Ukraine. In fact, we can never feel his appetite. If he conquers continental America, he's going to look to the moon to conquer. And that's something we need to come to grip with it, that, as you said earlier, we don't get to choose who our enemy is. Our enemy gets to choose that for us. And the problem with a very foolish Biden initiative early on was that he said we want some strategic stability with Russia, not realizing that a key tenet of Russian foreign policy is chaos. There's a great paper at Center for European Policy Analysis that it's called Strategic Chaos, Putin's strategy of chaos, that Putin deliberately promotes chaos because he can control it. And we cannot expect stability from Russia, so we can focus on China. We have to focus on both. And what I had a recent piece for the Bulwark, that America cannot be both cheap and ambitious. And we are trying to be cheap with global ambitions, and that's not how it works. We like to think we spend a lot on our military in comparison with our enemies, but one, we have different commitments, obligations, and ambitions than they do. And two, maintaining our military is quite more expensive than maintaining the Chinese military. They have a lot of people they don't pay in their military. 45% of military expenditure goes into personnel costs, just compensation for civilian and uniform members of the department, employees of the Department of Defense, 45%. On top of that, the cost of production, that is quite more expensive here than in China or in Russia or in Iran. And last but not least, compared to the Cold War, we don't spend anything on our military. Cold War military expenditure, all-time peak was in 1952, I believe, or 52 or 58, at 16%, and twice more, it peaked at 9% per GDP. And it never dropped to the level that it has dropped now.
I like to point out that when people talk about the military-industrial complex, I like to point out that when Eisenhower used that phrase, military-industrial complex, military spending was like 80% of the federal budget, and now it's 20% of the federal budget. So it's, a lot of other things have taken over as the complex that runs the federal budget.
Yes, and the biggest thing that's driving the federal budget is entitlements and mandatory spending, which was pre-COVID 3/4 of the GDP. 3/4 of the federal budget. So that's a real burden on the budget.
But I do think that what we need to have is a much greater focus on this, an attempt to try to reverse the drift that we've had in the last 10 years, really, this sort of this new Vietnam syndrome. And part of that is just creating the intellectual awareness, the wherewithal, and the voices out there sort of become shaking people out of this and pointing to, like you said, I think a great framework for it. Democracies try stupid things, they make mistakes, and then they have to learn from that and go back the other direction. And I think you need more people sort of pointing out this chaos that's happening around the world. This is the result of what we're doing, and pointing back to the other direction.
At the end of the day, what we need is leadership. I mean, I think the greatest crisis in American politics is lack of statesmanship that reveals its symptoms in all aspects of our society and politics. And one is foreign policy, that nobody wants to convince the American people one way or the other on anything. They just want to follow.
Yeah, there go the people. I must follow them, for I am their leader. It has become our motto of politics today. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me, and going to refer readers back to your article in Symposium, calling for making the case for the liberal Leviathan in foreign policy. Thanks so much for talking to me, Shay.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I'm Rob Trzynski. My guest today has been Shay Khatiri, a policy associate with the New Democracy Initiative and an author for The Bulwark and for Symposium. You can find more discussion about the ideas at the basis of a free society and policy ideas as well at symposium.substack.com. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like this on YouTube to help bring us more traffic and bring more attention to these ideas. Thank you for joining the conversation.